Hey, so tonight I wanted to talk about useState. So I'm just going to do a really simple example that will illustrate that. But first, I wanted to just kind of chat about it for a minute, just mano a mano. So in React, state is an object that represents the part of an app that can change. And I wanted to show you this little visual. So here's an app for your home. And what on this changes? Pretty much everything, right? Like 625, that's going to change. The percentage of the power usage, the temperature, the outdoor temperature, they're all going to change. And if they're going to change, they have to have state. That's the only way that they can change in this app. So each of these things would have to have its own state in order to change. So for example, if the temperature goes up to 75 here, then the app should refresh to reflect that new number. And you expect it to do this, right? That's the only way this is useful, is if it's re-rendering to reflect the new number. And so this is what React does when the state is changed. It re-renders the entire app. And there are a couple of reasons why the state might change. In this case, it's receiving input from a thermometer or something. And but in this bootcamp, it's mostly going to change based on a user clicking a button. So I'm going to go ahead and focus on that. So before you can use state, you have to import it. And useState is a React hook, and I think it's probably the most commonly used or the most important React hook. You're going to use it a lot. So you'll want to know how to import it. So you import it like this. You just put it here between the curly brackets. And there you go, it's imported. And so the next thing that you'll want to do is come down here. And one thing that you need to understand about hooks is that they only work inside of functional components. So there's a different way to do this kind of thing in a class component, but you can't use state. You don't use hooks in a class component. So that's why we're using a functional component here. And then the other thing is that you can't put hooks inside of like if statements or functions or loops. So you wouldn't want to put it down here or inside of a function. It needs to be at the top level. So that's why you always see it up here, just like right underneath the component, establishing the component right here, line 5. So what we're going to do here is get this going. So useState returns an array with 2 values. You've got the current state and then also the updated state. And then here inside of this, we're going to pass in the default state. And obviously we're not going to write it like this, but I kind of just wanted to show you, you want to put the current state here. This is to update the state, and then you'll have the default here. So in our counter, we want the default to be 0. So I'm going to change this one to 0. And it's important for these to make sense. So we'll just describe what we're doing here, which is a counter or counting. So I'm going to put count. And then here, this will set the count. And so that's how we start with that. Now, because we have that, we don't need this 0 here anymore, because by putting count here, we're going to default to 0. So this shouldn't change. This is the same. Yeah, so we've got that set up. And then you want to be able to change the count. And right now these buttons do absolutely nothing, right? So what we're going to do is add an onClick. Like I was saying earlier, the ways that we're going to use it generally in this bootcamp is when a user clicks a button. And so we're going to throw in this onClick, and we want it to subtract as this when you hit this button. And so we'll create a function up here that will change our state when that particular button is hit. Now this is the current 0, right? So you wouldn't want to put count here. That's like calling it. That's just 0. Or accessing it, kind of like down here. You're just accessing what's in there. In order to update it, you've got to use SetCount. So we're going to go SetCount. And what we want it to do is we want it to take the count and then subtract 1 from it. So it's as easy as just basically typing out what I just said. Count -1. So we're going to take this number that's being stored here and just subtract 1 from it. And when you do that, it is holding this state. So SetCount is changing the state. So this was 0, and every time you hit it, it changes, like it changed to -1. And then when you're changing SetCount, this is now -1, so then it becomes -2. And that is how we change the state that direction. But this is a counter, so we want to change it both ways. We want to have an onClick that also adds. So that way when the user clicks this button, it can also change the state. So we'll put a function here that is going to do pretty much the exact same thing. It's just going to add. My leg's falling asleep. It's just going to add 1 instead of subtract 1 to the count. So we've got SetCount, count +1. And then that way, see how it just automatically re-renders? I didn't refresh the page, anything, just this now works. This is now updating the state to add 1 to it. And yeah, every time you click it, SetCount is changing this count to count +1. And I don't want you to get confused by this because this has count in it. You can change it to anything. Like you could just say SetCount to 1 and it will change count to 1, which just means that, you know, every time you hit this, it will just be 1. But because we're trying to increment count specifically, that's why this word is in there. Does that make sense? I just didn't want you to think like you have to have that word in there. It's just in there because you're using it to adjust where you want the state to be. So we've got our counter done. Nope, I didn't save it. Still just turning it to 1. All right, so we've got this counter, and that's how you do that. I kind of wanted to do another example though, just to give you, you know, sometimes it's nice to have more than one example, them doing slightly different things. So I'm going to also have like a little greeting on this page, right? So we're going to do, I'm going to call it greeting, I guess. And we'll set the greeting. Okay, so in here, you're setting it to whatever the default is. So, I mean, you could have an array in here. You could have a hash. In this case, we're going to have an empty string because I don't want it to say anything yet. And then what we'll do is add some more buttons down here. I'm going to do a break so that it's not all squished up together. And here, we'll just write it out like this first. So this button's going to say dawn. I'm pushing Option Shift and the down arrow, and it gives me another one. And this one's going to say dusk. And in the middle, we want our word to appear. So for our greeting, so we're going to put the greeting in here. And the greeting is set to an empty string. So this is right, nothing should be showing up here. But if we want something to show up, then we're going to have to tell this, hey, when the user clicks this, I want you to run this function. And this one's going to be called morning. It will be called morning. Then we create this morning function up here. And what this morning function is doing is nothing because it doesn't have the arrow. There we go. Is that it is going to change the state of greeting. So in order to change or update it, we've got to use set. So we're going to set the greeting to, hey, stop that. Not cool. Not cool, bro. We're going to say, good morning. Good morning, mate. So now when we push dawn, it should greet us with a good morning, mate. But we got to add an onClick for our desk. So here we're going to do onClick, and this one's going to be morning. And again, I'm pushing Option Shift down arrow. Now I'm pushing Option down arrow. Although I have to do that one too. So, and then this one's called evening. And we're just setting the greeting. These are two different buttons that are changing the same state. What is the string, which is right here. And so this one's going to say evening. Yeah, that's how you spell that, right? Good evening, governor. And now at dusk, you get greeted with that in the streets of London. And that is how you change the state of the string in there. And like I said, you can have anything in here, arrays, hashes, numbers, strings, and it just, all depends what you've got on your page that you want to change and update. And that is what useState is for. That was my magical ending. You're welcome. So I hope that was helpful.